what I'm starting to realize is you are really empathetic to this thing, this idea of the vernacular or organic systems. And you would have to be. And how do you empower the people, right?
Yeah.
That's the end result.
Yeah.
With something so big, so centralized, something so concerned with governmental systems, how do you allow for the system to be organic?
Well, this is something that, has always been a key thing, and it comes down to trust. A lot of the question stems about trust from the proxy address point of view. There is always a sort of obstacle in terms of asking people to trust you if they are vulnerable and you're trying to convince them that you can help. I mean, there's been cases of, other things trying to help that have then been used to later use the same data to deport people who, for instance, shouldn't have, by law, been here. No one wants to put their head above a parapet like in an environment like that. And with what the trust should allow people to do is put their head above the parapet without fear of being shot, that they should be able to stand up and get help. And that's one of the key things with proxy address. One of the key things is we record as little data as possible. Right. So we're not interested in, it's a big kind of moral point in terms of what some things we can do and some things we can't. And there's a third point in terms of who can access that data. Now, the key thing is making sure we silo data. So anything that is, a good example is, for instance, if you are coming out of homelessness, one of the key problems at the moment is you have what's called a thin file. So it stops you from getting credit for years and years and years. Now, I'm not talking business loans. I mean, like paying utility bills is credit because you're paying in arrears. You're paying after you've used it, right? So it can be debilitating having that gap. With a proxy address, we can keep sort of automatic list of where you've been before, like before and after and during that period of instability and homelessness. So it bridges that gap and stops you having that big red warning on your file. Now, in order to actually put that to use, that needs to be available to a credit reference union, for example. Credit reference agency. Now, we won't ever share that without explicit consent. So every time that happens, and when I say explicit consent, I don't mean 4 pages of A4 terms and conditions. I mean straightforward, one sentence, plain English. This is what you're about to do and who you're about to share it with. This is who they are. Now, we need to make that kind of thing vastly obvious to the person who's using it, because they might have limited English use, they might have issues of vision, it's making sure there's that level of accessibility. But the other thing is, like, when you start to get to more sophisticated levels of what you can do, even with minimal data. So, for example, at the moment, a big problem that a lot of people face is what's called local connection. So if you're homeless, and I'll give you an example of a guy who I met in a homeless shelter who he was 17 when he used to live in Devon. He was 17 and both of his parents died. Now, both of his parents died. He had no place to be. So he moved to London to live with a friend. He fell out with a friend. I mean, he lived with a friend for, I think it's like a year or something. Then he fell out with a friend and was kicked out. So he's now sleeping rough on the street. So then he went to the council and said, I need help. They said, like, well, you're from Devon. Go back to Devon then. So he went back to Devon. And he's like, well, you don't have any family here. So go back to London. So he fell through the cracks because he couldn't, at that point, show any kind of utility bill to show he was there, couldn't show a council tax bill, voters registration, anything to show that he had lived there. So he didn't have a local connection and he wasn't that council's problem. Now, a good example of how data can be used in a good way here is if we can get, for instance, let's say that person was to then get a proxy address and we can get them a bank account. With open banking data, what you can do is you can, with that person's consent, start a kind of local connection proof, if you like. So rather than relying on a utility bill or all these kind of things that require an address, you can start to geolocate transactions. So if it's 50p in Tesco, quid in Sainsbury's, that kind of thing, you can say, look, here's a month's behavior. This person's been in your borough for a month. This is a local connection. You can demonstrate that they're there without having to get the traditional forms of proof of address. So then you get them into the system and you can start to help them. Now that's one of the more sophisticated ways you can use the data.
How do they find the movement data?
It's just geolocating transactions.
So they would have to be using some sort of, Apple Pay or...
No, just like using a Monzo card or something.
Right. What if they didn't have that?
well, if you get a proxy address, it comes with Monzo and Moniz and
so it's like a little starter package.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, there's so many ways in which we can do these kind of things to help. And this is one of the, I don't want to get too far off track, but like this is one of the key things that proxy address is it's not just about banking. It's not just about post. It's not just about a GP or a job or anything. It's about everything together. And I mean, we are, as you will have seen with the question to Sadiq just before Christmas, that we are going to be speaking with TfL and the mayor to try and get every person with a proxy address free zone 1 to 6 travel, so that they can go to all the meetings and appointments that they have to go to. Now, at the moment, TfL can't do that, because at the moment, if they said everyone who's homeless can get free travel, a lot of people are going to, oh yeah, I'm homeless now, can I get free zone 1 to 6, please? So you need to be able to prove that the person is homeless and the person is who they say they are. Now, we can do that in the way that we onboard people onto proxy address. So you might not have the proof of address that you normally have for these things, but we can start to offer people a real sort of safety net that isn't even there at the moment, even if all these services did work. But in terms of the data, the dangerous thing is if you start to, well, I'd say the danger is if, let's say, for instance, you could infer something from even minimal data sets that you aren't even aware about, but a third party really wants to know about a group of people. And for example, if we start to get people who are homeless, or even just people who move frequently, right? Like these are the groups who are really underrepresented in electoral roll. So if we can get those people onto the electoral roll, get them voting, well, then it becomes a political issue, and some people might not want, younger, more transitional people to have a vote profile. I mean, I'm speaking entirely speculatively here, but suddenly third parties might see an interest in being able to identify these people. That's when it comes down to trust, and I think the only way to demonstrate actual trust, or to build real trust, is to demonstrate that we won't be sharing that data, that we won't be allowing it to be used for marketing or adverts, by having a record of doing that. That's the only way we can really do it. I mean, we can.
It's tempting, though, isn't it?
No,
it's not.
No.
I mean,
you see, I was asked this once. In fact, I was asked this.
Just to clarify, sorry, to people who, we're talking about the idea that data is the most valuable thing today. It's more valuable than gold. The apps, the social media companies that are able to, be the conglomerates of today and have the kind of political power they do, and even to shift elections, is because they have human behavioral data. Yeah. So a project like Proxy Address does have the risk of harvesting incredibly valuable data at large scales, if not now, because I know it is for the homeless people, but if this was to become nationalized, if this was to become something that maybe worked on a level that didn't just have homeless people.
Yeah, and it would work for that. But to my mind, it's something to look at after we've done it for homelessness. I mean, it's priorities.
The risk and the temptation could be to use that incredibly valuable data, because companies would be knocking on your door, I imagine.
Maybe, but that's not what I'm in it for. I mean, I got asked a similar question once at the end of a talk, actually, and I'd explained sort of in a more structured way than I have done tonight, but the origins and the reasons why behind proxy address and all that stuff. And so I'd mentioned things like the average age of death and some of the stories of the people I'd spoken to, and one of the questions that came up was like, are you ever tempted just to commercialize it, right? Because there are commercial opportunities, there's like 4 or 5 clear use cases for how you could just use this and sell it to people for like, 200 quid a year or something, right? And, I did answer the question, but in the back of my mind, I was thinking like, did you not just hear all the stuff I just said? I don't want to sort of, come across as sort of, preachy or anything, but like when you sit with the people who have been going through these things, and you see the conditions that people are in, and you see how bad things are, the idea that you would just sell out for a quick buck is, I mean, it's not insulting because the intention was never meant to insult in terms of that question at the end of the talk. But no, because, the principle, this whole thing has been intended to intervene, to help people. And I'll give you an example of like how bad things are. In the Design Museum exhibition, I had sort of videos up from some interviews that I'd done. Now, there was about 25 people who were homeless who, very kindly agreed to be interviewed on video. And then there was probably about 10 people who were not homeless, who were like one person from the House of Lords, for example, one person from Royal Mail, just mixed in. And the idea was like different quotes were pulled out in text on separate screens, but all these people, you could see them talking and answering questions, but it was silent. So the idea was in this board, you could see the statements of people who were and weren't homeless, but you couldn't tell who was homeless and who wasn't, right? Because you shouldn't be able to just judge a book by its cover in that sort of sense. Of those 25 people, by the time the exhibition went down 4 months later, 5 of them were dead. Like every time I go back to shelters, another person I've spoken to, or I've had a chat with or coffee with has died. Like it's horrendous, the level of just kind of, that's just physical suffering, but the mental suffering that people go through, it's just absolutely horrendous. And as I say, most homelessness that people see in terms of a commute to and from work is rough sleepers sitting out. But the vast majority of people are in, shelters you wouldn't even know are there. They're sitting there with a cup of tea, they're getting kicked out at the evening and they're finding somewhere to, some friends, so forth. And And the stories you hear and everything. And so, yes, I could drop it all and try and commercialize it right now, but I just think, that's not why it's there. And when you hear about the differences it could make for people, like if it can have a fifth of that, like 10% of that, then I'll be happy, really, because otherwise, what the fuck are we doing?
I mean, look, at the end of the day, people are going to play the devil's advocate and, you can expect...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I wasn't referring at all to your question, by the way. When I was talking
it's good because, again, I just wrote a bloody dissertation about this and I didn't expect to have the stance I did when I started writing it. It's just, I think, given Cambridge Analytica and even Snowden and all of these things that have happened recently, these controversies, people have become incredibly distrusting of anybody who manages their privacy or their data. But then the difficulty is we have to integrate into it as well. If we don't, then you don't really have it's the new language. It's the new way of surviving in some ways for some people.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I should say as well is like one of the key mechanisms to make sure that, because, if I get hit by a bus tomorrow, I need to make sure that whoever picks it up isn't going to then sell it. It has to be structural protection. And as I mentioned earlier, we have as minimal data as possible. And so we have like the person, we have their proxy address, we have where they're at right now, which could be like collection point for post or something. And we have a history of that. That's it. Now, if you are a bank, for example, you're storing information about their banking things. But then if you're the GP, you're storing information about their medical things. But those are siloed off organizationally. Like proxy address doesn't have any information about your banking. Proxy address doesn't have any information about your GPs. So we have just like the sort of, we're the ones who are able to draw the threads between these things, but nothing comes down those threads. And essentially the reason for that is that, in most cases, when people need your address, they don't need your location, right? They need, it's essentially, like if you go to an airport, or let's say you buy a plane ticket and you go to the airport and you've given your address, they don't need your location. So if John Smith 1 and John Smith 2 both turn up to a terminal, they can differentiate you. And that's how it's done in most cases. It's basically a linchpin for data. And so it's not the address as such, it's what's attached to the address. Now, that data, if you don't have the address, is nowhere. And that's why you can't prove your ID and why you can't access services. So what we do is we replace it with the proxy address, and therefore there's a place for that data to go. But that data isn't necessarily held by us. It's also it's the linchpin, the proxy address that enables other organizations to store it in a traditional way using their existing operations. So it's kind of devolved, if you like, as well.
I guess it's where it could go is more people. I mean, again, I'm playing the devil's advocate. That it's, especially if you try to think of this as how others who aren't homeless could benefit from a system like this, then it really starts to get into a territory where, I mean, I would even, after writing something like this, I would still say, and if anyone does read it, they'll see in the conclusion, there has to be a level of kind of an entrepreneurial spirit to most things.
Yeah.
And what is the problem if, you have transparency, if you have, consent, if you have all these things that have been taken place, and there's a measure to also, take people to account regularly, which is, at the end of the day, is what governments do. Then there should be, an opportunity for kind of, really getting into the entrepreneurial aspects of it, because again, there are some people often think that if it's gonna solve big problems and it's, help humans and be altruistic, then it should have nothing to do with money whatsoever.
Right. Yeah.
But then some people also think that if it has loads of money coming in, then it will obviously be incredibly dehumanizing.
Yeah, this is an important point, I think. So for instance, proxy address is a social enterprise, right? So that was something there was a lot of time and thought put on, that it's not a charity, it's not a profit maximizing limited company either. It's a social enterprise which locks in the articles that at least half of the money is reinvested for good causes. So for me, that was a deliberate decision, because I'd spent by the point I made that decision, I'd spent enough time around charities to see how much time they spend on funding applications and things like that, and they're all going for the same lot, and it's incredibly competitive. And actually, what I saw proxy address as being is something that is individually sustainable as a business, and yet with social purpose at its core. And for me, I completely agree. Like I don't like the implication that if you're doing social good, you have to be a charity. Yeah. Because, the implication there is like, oh, I'm not a charity, therefore I've got no obligation to do social good. Surely the best possible model for any kind of capitalist endeavor is that it is a sustainable business and its net impact on the world is good. Like, that's the ideal thing, right? Like, if we could all do that, then, everybody's happy.
I mean, it then defeats also the point. If it wasn't, it defeats the point of what we want to do as architects at the end of the day. Because an architect, you need to, no one would say, oh, you're an architect, you're making money, you're evil. No, but architects do. But architects do want to solve, some of them, most of them want to solve problems. They want to solve social issues and such. But
this again, comes back to that point you're talking about, sort of tangible and intangible, and sort of qualitative and quantitative value within architecture, because I think that conversation does happen in architecture in terms of justifying any value or any fee that you bring. And I think for me, this is one of the core drivers as well behind why I've set up my studio to not just be buildings. It is that it came from this research into unpaid overtime, and on the basis of the fact that essentially, I mean, it went quite deep into sort of like the first or second chapters were all about philosophy. So it was sort of drawing an alignment between Heidegger and Marx, which is...
I got a quote from Heidegger from your paper.
Oh, good.
Because I wanted to talk about it, so this is a good segue. And he said, the erecting of buildings cannot be understood adequately in terms of either architecture or engineering construction, nor in a mere combination of the two. Yeah. Which I was like, what? Okay, I get the first half, and then it cannot be understood by even a combination of the two. Which actually, correct me if I'm wrong, is the kind of is inciting that architecture is such a multidisciplinary thing that for you to constrain it and define it by just just design or just engineering, the aesthetics or the actual science behind building, is in of itself still a disservice to what architecture is, because there's so much philosophy behind it. There is so much science behind it. There's so much, psychology behind it. So
no, absolutely, and I think
your practice reflects that, right?
I'd hope so. And I mean, I think it's been a while since I looked at that paper, but as I remember, there was one of the core arguments in it was the fact that essentially when we're a service industry, basically, right? We provide services to a market. Now that might be a couple doing a house extension. It might be a large conglomerate doing a headquarters. It could be anything in between. But essentially, we're selling architectural services to a client. And that client needs to assign a value to what we do. And generally speaking, you're going to be selling it to a client who isn't from an architectural background, right? So what you find is the market tends to assign value based on quantitative basis, right? Like you can put a number against it, and that is something where, oh yeah, clearly he's, bought me 5 cars of X value. There is this much fee to pay. When it's qualitative value, it's very hard to sort of put a number against that. And for me, I think part of what Heidegger's quote there is getting at is that like there is kind of an ephemeral. There's obviously he loved the phenomenological, but there's greater value than just the quantitatives and just what you see or what can be listed on a spreadsheet. There is a deeper value to things, and the problem I think that architecture faces is we're always selling this speculatively. Like the number of times I've gone to a finished building with a client, they're like, "Oh, fantastic!" It's like, if only we had this reaction when we were actually getting like negotiating the fee, as we designed it. Because first of all, like you have to show the designs of the building through abstract means, whether it's renders or even VR. It's still abstract. I mean, I think Mies built like the crawler house in 1:1 out of Hessian for a client. Like unless you do that, even then that's still abstract, right? Like so you're always selling your services on the basis of something that's intangible and isn't yet there. It's always speculative. So that already is hard to justify because there's nothing tangible that they can say they've got. But then also this idea that the market, generally speaking, is understanding quantitative things. And our value as architects, our value as architects is made up of qualitative and quantitative things. But our USP, like the thing that makes us architects rather than builders, is the qualitative thing, right? And increasingly over time, like if you look at the history of the profession, the role of the architect, 150 years ago, you might have got architects doing a sort of ventilation strategy or something, right? Like now you need a 4-year master's degree to touch it because it's so sophisticated. And what you find is that the quantitative parts of the architecture role, to my mind, have become so sophisticated. Like any technology becomes more and more sophisticated. It splits into more and more specialisms, right, in order to cover the ground. And construction is the same. Like everything's become more and more sophisticated. So now what would have been one person's job is 3, etc., etc. But it's harder to fit it within the remit of the architect. And so what you end up with is the proportional role that the qualitative side plays is larger. As we lose things like, some architects say, oh, we need to reclaim the role of the project manager and stuff like that. I just think, well, it's already gone. And actually what we need to do is realize where we are. And what we're doing is we're selling part of our service, which is easy to translate to the market, and the other part, which is not. And that part is what defines us as architects. So we can never get rid of it or move on from it. So we need to find a way to try and communicate that. And people have tried that for a long time. In the paper, I remember I spoke to Cabe at the time, who was still there.
For people who don't know, they're the sort of government advisory group, right?
Yeah, Commission for Architecture and the Built Environment. And they were later sort of combined into the Design Council, and then I think largely dissolved now. But they were there to essentially act as guardians of quality within the built environment. So they would do these, essentially crits on actual schemes, and you could be called in to review by Cabe. Unfortunately, there was lots of issues with that. There's a guy called Owen Hathley who wrote a great book on British architecture, and he sort of coined the term Cabeism. And essentially what happened, by his argument, is that in an attempt to try and define what good design should be, in other words, to quantify the amorphous qualitative values that we work to, it ended up being essentially like an a la carte menu, like a checkbox. So you get developers who may, perhaps with a hint of cynicism, come in and say, oh yeah, we've engaged with the public realm because look, our columns are diagonal, and yes, we've rejuvenated the view because we've got coloured Trespa cladding, and like actually it became a thing as long as you reach the threshold of a tick. And so what you got is quite a lot of not great architecture, but that just happened quantitatively to fulfill a checkbox exercise. And what was fascinating is that I went to the company called Eclipse Consulting, who had worked with CABE to create some of the reports. And they had tried to do just this, to quantify the qualitative value in order to, this is part of this bigger question that remains to this day. How do we communicate the value as architects that we provide as a service? It's no one's yet squared the circle on this. So
it extends to academia as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And first of all, if you accept that the basis of the question isn't fundamentally flawed, which for me is a leap anyway, because like when people try and define the value of academia in terms of changed productivity or GDP, and it's like it's not really the point of academia. Actually, it's not. It's maybe part of it. It's not the full part of it.
No, imagine doing a checklist of Picasso's painting. Does it achieve the emotive? 5 out of 6. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly, right. And this it speaks entirely about that balance between art and science within architecture. And so what Eclipse Consulting had done is made this report, and there was this table which I sort of picked them up on because it was talking about. So this was near the end of my research, and they had basically tried to tabulate the value that comes from engaging with an architect, and it was pretty much the exact Marxian values. So it's like use value, exchange value, labor value, these things that Marx defined in Das Kapital. And but then, so I was like reading this, like, oh, that's first of all, it's really interesting that they've used Marxist values here. But secondly, I'm like waiting for that column where it's really qualitative stuff, because it's quite easy to translate labor value across, or exchange value.
There are aspects that you could quantify.
100%. So my sort of argument in there before I got to it was that you had Marx's 5 causes of being, and then you had kind of like 4 causes of capital value, and that there was not an exact lining up here, and that's where the architecture isn't translating into the market. And so I was waiting for that kind of value to come through and what we would do for the missing one, and it was listed as wow value.
Wild.
Wow.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, quite. And so I picked him up on this.
We've got a wow specialist coming in.
Yeah.
He's going to be our...
Yeah. The wow says 6 out of 10. Like I said to him,
they judge you on how loud he goes, wow.
Yeah, exactly. So I remember saying to this chap from Eclipse, and they're saying, okay, I can see how you can assign values to this, but the fact that wow value is in a table doesn't mean you can quantify it. And he was like, yeah, I know. And then it's like, yeah, we got stuck. I think I got him to the point where he was saying like, yeah, I mean, we can't quantify qualitative value. I mean, that's absurd. I was like, well, could you not just summed it up in the first paragraph then? Because this is part of the challenge. I've gone on such a tangent, I can't even remember what the original question was, to be fair. But this for me is, it's the unpaid overtime thing. And for me, this is part of the challenge, that what I find is that and I worked a lot of overtime in my time, and none of it paid.
Practices, yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah, and the reason that we were doing it wasn't for the same reason that people who work in like more quantitative environments would do it. It was because we were looking at more options. It's because we were exploring on, we were pushing further and further and further on things like design aspects that don't have a finish point.
The practice was, or you as individuals?
As a team, like that's why we were staying late, because we had a deadline and we were like, we need to get more options. We need to interrogate this further, blah, 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 blah. And that's good to do. But you should be paid for it if you're a business. If you're relying, like my argument was that if you rely on that to get your conceptual reputation.
Unpaid.
Yeah. If you're relying on sort of, staff to, I mean, unpaid is tricky because you're on a salary, not per hour, right? So there's an assumption that you're kind of covered for all work. But, I ran through the National Statistics Agency and found that we were working more overtime than any other profession in the UK in architecture anyway. But the basis is, if you, for instance, are working on the basis of a fee and a quality that requires overtime to achieve both, and a timescale that requires overtime, then that's not really a valid business model. Like, really, if you're going to hold it to task.
But how many of architecture practices currently are like?
So many. And that was my argument, is that at the moment, what that overtime does is it artificially inflates our ability, the perception of our ability as a profession to achieve what we're currently achieving. And no one would say that, like, it's working that well. But, like, if you look at it from that point of view, like, so the most overtime I worked in practices were in the ones that would say they have, the better reputations and things. The lesser overtime in the ones that would crack on and essentially kind of get it done. And there was this kind of linear correlation. And I'm not saying it's causation, but, like, there was this kind of correlation whereby I remember thinking, like, you know what, if every one of these hours was paid to the staff, like, if you took the salary, like, if you took what the basis of that agreement was, right, you took salary, you took your 37.5, 40 hours per week, whatever, you worked out your hourly rate and extended it to include the 80-hour, 60, 70, 80-hour weeks and adjusted it accordingly, business is going under.
Yeah.
And if it becomes the basis on how you operate rather than an exception, of course it's a creative field, like, it'll be an exception. But it should be an exception, not the basis for how you operate. And if we do, then it doesn't speak well for how the...
So how do we get past this? Because one thing I wanted to talk about is you obviously wrote an academic paper on this. Was it for master's, PhD, or?
So I did it at the Bartlett for Part 2 for history and theory, and then I did a 2-year part-time research degree afterwards on the Bartlett.
Wow, okay. So you extended further. Okay. So, because as you came from a kind of, you obviously have to bring both sides to the table, and, you talk about statistics of why this is. And we need to know. And I think especially today, people don't know, people are often, we talked about this thing of outrage for the sake of outrage. People who, they will, as soon as they deem something unfair, they will jump onto, the bandwagon of let's demonize it. But there's always reasons to things.
Yeah.
And the way you solve those problems is not to attack and,
to understand.
Is to understand and look at the system and see where things need tweaking. And that's essentially what an academic paper would do. And I think what you did. So you talked about a coping mechanism. Tell us more about that.
I can't remember using that term, actually.
I think you can probably think of it now, is that the coping mechanism was probably applied to the businesses. For them, they need to basically survive.
Yeah, right. I see what you mean. Oh, sorry. I see. Yeah. Well, for me, I think there is, and this is a conversation I've had within the last few years with a practice I worked at, where there was I remember I walked through an office and I saw, like, I think it's like 3 or 4 different Part 2s all inventing dry lining to concrete soffit head detail. And I knew that I could point into that detail in like 6 different projects. It was already done. It's you could look it up in the white book. It's done. It's an industry standard. It shouldn't be reinvented because it will just get uninvented again on site. But there were, there was a lot of hours going into this. Now, I think it's important that people have the ability to go through that process to understand something like that. But my argument to that practice was there are parts of buildings we can try and standardize because we do it the same way in every building. If we're doing like dry lining to soffit, right? That's not where the design is. I mean,
for some people. I mean,
Yeah, it shouldn't be where the design is.
Corson might have a new way of doing it.
Yeah, that's fair. I'm talking about let's say
know.
above a suspended ceiling, right? So it's something you're not going to see. I mean, there's opportunities for design in everything, but let's say, for instance, it's not one.
I think your business model is going to struggle if you're going into that.
Absolutely. If every single one is bespoke, that's going to be quite the bill. So my argument was that, like, look, and I still haven't found a way to properly like articulate this argument without sounding like slightly barbaric about it. But what I'm trying to avoid saying is like, look, there is design on the skin, and then you can standardize things beyond. Like, obviously, in terms of spatial design, that's really critical. In terms of the actual detailing, that's critical. In terms of what you see and how it stands and all that kind of stuff, all of that is critical.
What is perceived.
Yes, but there was always bits that are back of house, shall we say, that can really be standardized, just to kind of make things a bit more efficient. And I put this to the practice, and the response was, well, no. Essentially, how I interpreted the response was that it was kind of a philosophical position that we will not standardize because that would somehow risk diluting the conceptual fidelity of what otherwise could be pure.
Wow, okay.
Right? Which is fine, but I think in architectural practice, there's always another project there, which is the project of the business. And now I've had, for instance, as an employee, tender deadlines where the entire material of an entire Windows package was changed at 10:30 p.m. the night of a tender issue, right? And I've, with somebody else, stayed there till like 6:30 in the morning to change all the details. That's not great. And that got to change back as well there. But these kind of things, like there are proper ways to, like, okay, I'm trying to think of a good way to explain this. If you see the business as a project as well, then I think the opportunity for someone to sit there and in isolation try and invent a new, dry lining head detail, for example, is outweighed by the value to see a project well run within. It's similar to what I was saying before about proxy address, right? You need to acknowledge your constraints, and those constraints could be planning laws, right? They could be building regs, but there are also the constraints of being able to be sufficient as a business to actually survive.
What about the constraints on top of that of the well-being of the
staff?
employees?
Yeah, that's what we're coming to as well. Like that, to impart that discipline on being able to achieve the best you can within a certain time frame is really critical. And the reason why I say that's critical is because, let's say, for instance, you did go and design bespoke, head details for partitions, right? They're not going to survive, right? They're like, value engineering, we all know and love.
Into that, like, yeah, that's nice.
Yeah. I mean, if you're doing the next Scarpa or something, then run with it. But if it's going to be like an office block in Slough, maybe that's not the place to do it. And the danger for me is that sometimes on projects we end up trying to design a 10, but doing so ignoring the constraints that will bring it down to a 6, because you are then going to at a later stage have to value engineer things when, like, the skeleton of the building's been built, and then you've got more constraints. You can't actually get a good design. I would rather design an 8 out of 10 that I can achieve an 8 out of 10 rather than design a 10 out of 10 that I know will end up as a 6. And I think it's that it's just having that sympathy for the contingencies on which we practice means that working late doesn't mean working better, like working more options. Like the amount of people who I've spoken to since setting up my own practice who are like who take the opportunity to sort of regale me with stories of architects meetings that they've hated, which is always, I don't know why they feel that they need to tell me this, but it's a good way to warn me of their own personal red flags. But some of the, a consistent thing that's come up is that clients have told me stories about, and then we asked them to do X, Y, Z, and then they came with 20 options. It was mind-boggling. Like, we were paying them to pick an option, not to present us with the fact that they can come up with 20 different.
And why is that a problem? Do you think that's a problem? If a client was to take, if you kind of, because it's almost as if this is a new type of practice, which is embarrassing to admit, where we're trying to say, okay, now let's think of ways we can make our profession more sustainable in a holistic way, by maybe leveraging off certain things that don't need to be really, that are starting to cause problems elsewhere. And one of those things could be, on some projects that do require, or they can allow for it, that the client takes on a more leading role with certain things. I know that's a nightmare for an architect, because it can get really out of control, because you do need to maintain that level of agency in a design. But surely there should be a kind of flexibility in practice that for one project maybe there is somebody who needs it to be that home needs to be such a intimate, and I can imagine if you say someone we're going to design your ideal home, they would need to be the lead designer in most ways.
Yeah, and I think that's like, this is one of the things I love about architecture, is the sheer spectrum of how many different jobs there are in one profession, right? So like if you're designing a private home, it almost like your job almost becomes like therapist or investigative journalist. It's like you have to get out of them the information that they don't even know that is relevant. And but for me, if you're designing like a private home, it's so different, because you're designing for the people who will live there. In a lot of buildings, what you're doing is you're designing with the client representative of an organization who may never even step foot in that building. The people who go in and out of that building day in, day out, they're not agent, or they don't have agency over that designing process, which again is why I think there is that duty on the architect to actually act in the interests of the end users, because quite often, it's one step removed. The end users and the architect tend to have the same interests. The end user might not. The sort of direct client might not have the exact identical.
Exactly, and in many ways, if we're now talking about, let's think of the realities of what architecture school should be doing for you. That might be one of those things. How do you step into the kind of, communal empathy of what people want? I feel like there should almost be a module in universities where there's a social or kind of humanist or even psychological, module where let's understand how humans behave and what humans want. What do we want in a space?
And I think as well, for me, one of the key things is to be able to go off and proactively do some of these things. So one of the reasons I really enjoyed Proxy Address was that as an architectural employee, what I found is essentially, according to a resourcing plan, I was presented with work that was already there. And so I would immediately come to a project, there would be a client, a brief, a site, et cetera, et cetera. With Proxy Address, it was like, okay, I think this is a problem. I think this might be a solution. And then I had to go out and knock on people's doors and say, like, I've inferred that you might have this problem. And they're like, oh yeah, I do have that problem. But I would have to call them up out the blue and go, hi, you don't know me. And it's that kind of, off the beaten road sort of exploring that was really interesting for a change. Like, I think
that's an exciting part of this profession as well.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I think if we can, as architects, sort of self-initiate, or at least sort of, I do think for me that the most interesting projects are ones that have that little spark of kind of investigative journalism, where it's about finding out the answers below what is immediately apparent. And that takes a lot of that takes the sort of entrepreneurial attitude, which I think is generally taught or encouraged in university as well.
Incredible, yeah. And just to kind of summarize that unpaid internships thing that we started on, you made me really understand a crucial aspect of that, and it's when you said the kind of distinction between qualitative and quantitative, it is those practices who are so concerned with the qualitative aspects of their brand, of their profession, that end up maybe falling into the practice of, extremely unethical working conditions. But it is, you're almost saying that they can change that, because what they need to do is they need to obviously they think that they're doing that because, they need to make they need to get the bills done. They need to be able to, pay for what, they're sustaining. But there's that, notion of leveraging out what might not be constructive for the practice in the first place. Like, let's say if the Zaha Hadid architects who, maybe do, every now and then have people who, bounce on the opportunity for an internship, whether it's paid or not. If they were to standardize certain details, then, maybe they would be on a better business model, which then would allow them to pay people. Or
yeah, I think so. It's slightly tricky, isn't it? Because I mean, I don't doubt that Zahas is a good business model. I think they could obviously pay.
Let's take Ishigami, because he's been proven, in questionable or non-questionable ways of having unpaid internships. Do you think his business model could be improved?
I mean, I think using unpaid internships shouldn't be allowed for a start. So. I mean, I have seen talk about the fact that it's a kind of cultural thing because it happens a lot in Japan, etc., which I can't really speak to. But just on my own principles, I would say unpaid internships shouldn't be allowed, and I think it's not something that you can expect a commercial market to fix, because I think if you take the case of practices that are fully able to pay staff but don't, it's because of their reputation that they feel they don't have to.
But they wouldn't be able to pay them if they were doing those stupidly long hours.
Well, I think someone like a practice like Zaha's probably could.
I would think that they would say that they couldn't.
I might say that, yeah. I don't know, but this is my point. So that I'm getting to is I think it's for people like the RIBA to interject, and you wouldn't expect, like in the financial markets, for example, you would you would expect organizations to act in the interest of shareholders and in the interest of profit maximization. It's a commercial entity, it has shareholders. Same with Zaha's, it has shareholders. Its responsibility, primarily as a business, is to maximize profits. And as a architecture studio, it's very different things. Obviously, they have a lot of sort of conceptual focus to achieve, as well as reputational, etc., etc. Now, if we're going to talk purely as a business point of view, I think it would be naive to suggest, as I was sort of half doing there, that Zaha's could, or perhaps would pay overtime. I mean, some companies had done historically. I think HOK, SOM, they historically paid overtime.
I think there's one or two now who do that.
Yeah. And I mean, there've been recent headlines about, certain shareholder payments for Patrick and things in Zaha's, and they're not short of a few bobs. So I think they certainly could, but it's whether or not they would, or why would they, and would that actually be against the interests of their shareholders? And my argument would be the RIBA should do something like that, especially at the internship level. So what I was looking at is more institutional, qualified, and intern. It's not just
So what would the RIBA do ideally?
Well, I think if you're looking at placements and internships, I think it's very difficult to say, you'll lose your chartered status if you do this, because then you've got to go and inspect it. I think what you should do is to say any part 1 or 2 placements done at somewhere that has that year been proven to have unpaid interns will not be valid for a PEDR. You take away the supply. Why would you apply to Zaha's if it's never going to go on your PEDRs?
Oh.
So you take away what is a privilege of being recognized as somewhere valid to learn about professional practice.
Wow. So for example, Arthur Mamumani was on the previous episode, and he said that he was honored in a way of the opportunity to get the chance to work at Zaha, whether it was paid or not.
Right.
And for people like that, and I think there are a lot of them. And again, the cultural thing is an interesting one, because in Japan they often cite that in the Japanese culture they have this kind of is your master, your elder and your master. You go and don't expect to receive, expect to give, and only then you can master this kind of profession. What about the complete other side to this? And that's, let's say your practice right now, and let's say you're a couple of fans of the proxy address start applying to your practice tomorrow, but they're not that experienced or qualified, and the value they bring to your business at the end of the day doesn't really it's not proportional. And I know this all links in with everything else, like what is the academic system really doing to prepare people for jobs? Don't you think that this is a symptom and a sign that something is going wrong in universities, that we are having to have businesses say that, look, these people are not valuable enough for us to throw money down, because at the end of the day we're not making the profits from having them, therefore we have to resort to things like unpaid internship, especially when they themselves consent to it and they themselves value it and they themselves are seeing it as a intangible value. What do you say to that?
Well, I mean, I've had plenty of people ask me if they can work for me, and then I've said, like, not ready to sort of take on that sort of pastoral role or anything, and then some have come back and said, I'll even do it unpaid. Wow. Like, no, like you
still say no.
Yeah, because it's, even if somebody sees the value in it for them to do it, and I'll hold my hand up here. So when I was at Zahaz, it was unpaid. Now what I did is I did 3 internships in my part 1 year out, for 4 months each, and the first one was one where I was studying in Edinburgh, and you do a sandwich course, so you go back to uni after your first part 1. In that first one, I saved up enough money to enable myself to get to Rotterdam to do OMA. And then I saved up a little bit there, which enabled me to go...
Wait a minute, you got Zaha, Foster's, OMA...
I was striking the star architects off. Yeah, I got out of my system early in my career. But then by the time I got to London, I was very lucky because I had an uncle who lived in London. So I slept on his spare sofa, and on his sofa, and walked into Zahaz. Packed my own lunch every day, etc., etc. So the small amount of savings I'd got from being a part 1 in the previous ones paid for me to get there. And that, even then, was still based on the fact that I was lucky enough to have an uncle who lived in London. Now, if I didn't, I couldn't have gone. And now, whether or not it's a privilege to work for a practice like that,
reality is very different for most people.
Very different. And I think one of the, there are lots of groups who are marginalized from architecture, historically and today. But I think the ability to engage with people who aren't from a privileged background is really lacking in the profession today. Like, working class, first of all, you've got to study for so long and get so much stress and debt, right? But then also, I mean, so I was part of a charity called Arts Emergency, which partners sort of people from disadvantaged or poorer backgrounds with people who are doing what they want to do within the arts, and it's everything from theatre to comedy to architecture. So I had a mentee, and like she was coming up through her A-levels and was wanting to apply to architecture, and she wanted to apply to architecture, that's fine. So I helped her, and she's in uni now studying, which is great. But there was always a little voice in the back of my head saying, like, can I actually recommend this? Because you can get a lot of debt. Like, go be a dentist. Like, it'll be sure to study and you'll have a Cessna in like 5 years, But, it wasn't for me to judge that. So I kept that to myself. But I think the difficulty is that if you end up with only people from certain slivers of society designing the environment for that society, that environment will be naturally biased towards people's experiences. I found this when I was at OMA. I remember thinking about one guy who was like designing a swimming pool, and this guy was working 140-hour weeks or something ridiculous. And like, how are you designing a swimming pool? You haven't had time to go swimming in 7 years. You have to have some degree of empathy with the situation.
Do some field research, please.
Yeah, and architecture, historically has been the person goes off on the gentleman's tour of Europe and comes back and
We should bring that back.
Yeah, but it's very hard to. Well, I think there's it's incredibly exclusionary to people from less affluent backgrounds.
Of course.
And I think it's a really important thing to address. And I think if you have unpaid internships at things like Zaha's, which, as I say, I was lucky enough to stay on my uncle, so I kind of have already taken advantage of this to that degree. But I think it's a negative thing, because it means that you are defining who gets into those practices by economics, not by ability. And
wow,
that's dangerous.
But principally, in hindsight, it's actually, even though there might have be some, short-term, small-scale positive aspects to it, in hindsight, it's not a very, ethical system.
No, absolutely.
And you can really see that. So, you're born in Liverpool.
Yeah.
You don't have a Scouser accent.
No.
It's almost Welsh.
Oh, really?
In a way.
How dare you? No, so my mum is from Dublin, so she's got a
no, sorry, it's Irish, sorry.
I've got, my dad's from Yorkshire, and then I was 5 years in Edinburgh, and now I'm in London, so it's a mutt accent. So it's all over the shop, yeah.
Does this ring any bells?
Oh, okay.
Hanging Gardens of the Circle Line.
Oh,
Yeah. So that was a project for what?
That was actually my final year project at the
Masters.
Yeah.
So that, that's 7 years old, I imagine, right?
It's older than that. It's 12 years old now. No, 11 years old. 11 years old. 2009 I finished.
More than a decade ago, your interest still seemed very kind of focused on social political change.
Yeah, actually, yeah. So I was going to mention that project when you're talking about sort of titles of projects and things earlier, because that was one where it was actually sort of the visible part of that project now is largely what I'd reinvented after the Bartlett. So I put it forwards into a competition called Forgotten Spaces after I graduated. And I think at the time in the Bartlett, I had been slightly sucked into that, what was at the time that dystopian aesthetic. And so what I presented was vaguely dystopian and grey and dark, and then I thought, this is a project about gardens, this should be colourful, this should be like joyous, it shouldn't be like barren mud. And so I reinvented it and did it in a very different style and sort of slightly redesigned it. And I remember I was working from the office I was working at the weekend to get that done, and I was like, I need to, what should I call this project? And the first thing that came to mind was Hanging Gardens at the Circle Line, right? And I thought, immediately I was like, that's stupid. And then I spent ages thinking of all these like really clever names and stuff. I just came back to it. I was like, actually, and that's one of the reasons I went with proxy dress as well, which is that I learned then, that day, that the first thing that, if there's any idea that instantly pops into your mind, that's probably the best one. Really? Because that will be the one that pops into other people's minds.
Right.
Like, even if you think it's a bit silly,
you know
sit
what?
with it for a little while.
You know what? I get that with the titling these videos.
Really?
Yeah. Because I come up with the title after I speak, because I'm like, oh, that was about such and such.
Exactly. Relying on your gut is a really important thing to be able to do.
And that one was sort of basically, it was looking at the defunct ventilation shafts of the trains and of the tunnels, right? Of
that's
Circle
right.
Line, and changing them into gardens.
Yeah. It was really weird. So basically around London, when London had the very first underground railway system in the world, right? But for the first ones, it was subsurface. So it wasn't tunneled. It wasn't dug out by a machine like a mole. They literally dug a trench around London, lay down the tracks, covered it up again. And so what you did is, you had this sort of shallow railway track all the way around. And they had steam trains on the tracks then. And obviously you don't want to fill the whole stations with steam, because, well, people tend to die then. So it's not good for customer numbers. So they had what's called a condenser on the train. So it's basically like the train holds its breath between platform to platform. But sometimes it's too far. So they have to have a kind of hole, a ventilation shaft halfway along. So the train would go, stop, let off the steam, and then start holding its breath.
So that's, you see that on Baker Street, right? In the tunnels at Baker Street.
Is that Baker Street, actually? I
feel like
it possibly is, actually, yeah. Because there's about 30 across the Circle Line. Wow. And because the Circle Line is made up of the old Metropolitan and I think the old District, and those were the first ones. And what it means that you have is you have this connection between above ground and below ground. And this was sort of the nature of the brief for that year's project. It was about thresholds, liminal states, which is another term that only architects use. But these thresholds between things. And what I'd started to look at was the kind of environmental threshold that takes place there, because as part of my research, I was really interested in kind of above ground, below ground, just as a broader principle. So I decided to get to understand the below ground of London, if you like. Now, I wasn't going to go break into tube tracks or anything. So what I did is I broke into sewers instead. So there's a subset of what do you call them? Urban exploring, called drainers, who do that. They break into sewers and explore them. And
I've heard of the ones where they break into abandoned.
Yeah, abandoned buildings and stuff. So the drainers are like that, but for sewers. And basically, I found a website of some people who had, been around London.
You made the website, to be honest.
I wish I did. It's great photos. But I did what's called a who is lookup on them. So, when you register a domain, you give your name and address and phone number and stuff. Now, these days, mostly they're protected by domain security. Mm-hmm. Back then, it would just pop up somebody's name and number. So I just called them up and said, first of all, just to let you know, I can find your name and number if you're doing these things. And then secondly, can you do me a favor and bring me down? So he was happy I raised it to him, that I wasn't the police. And then, so we went to the sewer. And so there's 3 of us. We went down twice. And we went from just north of Kentish Town to down below King's Cross. So it's not very far, but it took us about 4.5 hours each time.
Jeez. Wait, this was legal?
No. And I've checked statute of limitations, so I can talk about it. But it's also the only place I thought I was going to die ever. Because we went down, and the frustrating thing is you go down, and they had kind of like a key that they'd forged themselves. So it's like the council key to open the drain. So you go down, but then to come up, you can't get through the grating. So you have to rely on finding an unlocked one. So we were going down, and it's a sewer, so you can use your imagination to fill in the blanks of exactly what it's like here. But there was one part where it's beautiful. It was all these beautiful basil jet design brick arches and stuff. But
there's no light, no?
Well, it had torches.
Oh,
yeah.
So it was designed.
Yeah.
What was it before? Must have been something.
No. Before it was a river. So this is the River Fleet. So it used to be an uncovered river, and then as part of Basil Jet's sewer system across London, they bricked it all up. And so it's like a hidden river.
But why have they designed beautiful?
Because it's Victorian, man. It's that's what Victorians do. That's why they do good joinery around the back of cabinets and stuff. Even if you don't see it, it's made true. And it is beautiful brickwork. And
there are pictures of this.
Yeah. If you go on the website, there's some there. I think it's
on your website.
Yeah,
it will be linked at the bottom of the video. Anyway.
I think it's called Notes on the Underground or something. And but it was kind of 2 tiers in a sense. So there was the water that we were on. And then there's a lower level. Then there's a big hole below, because the sewer systems are completely stacked. They're crazy complex. And we were setting up for a photo there because it was, really nice thing. So we got the photo. This photo was in there. But quite often as you're doing this, you hear roaring water, downstream, because there's steps and stuff, and it's like.
And are you on the layer where the water runs?
Yeah.
Oh God.
And so it's quite normal to hear the running water. What you don't want to hear is water running from upstream, because not 30 minutes before that, they had taken the time to explain to me, we'd been underground for 2 hours at this point, they actually explained to me that in order to clean the sewers, what they do is they flood them, right? And no one knew we were down there. So we hear this rushing water, and they were so cool the whole time and everything, and then not that time. At that point, they dropped everything. The tripod just went down the sewer. We got onto this. We jumped about 6 foot down onto another level, climbed the ladder, which is below a locked grate. So just people walking above us. We're not shouting help until the water comes, and we were waiting for the water to come. And then actually the hole down to the lower level went, it exploded like a geyser, and actually they were flooding the lower level below us. It was terrifying. What was even worse was the fact that we were like, okay, we need to get out. So we had to keep going. And it took us another 2.5 hours to get out because nothing was unlocked. It was awful.
If you videoed that, that would have been, that would have been quality. That would have been a little, BBC would have done a little documentary.
Well, because the photos I took were taken with an SLR I borrowed from the...
And these fixed photos are on the website?
Yeah.
I'm going to check these out as soon as I can.
So the photos were taken with an SLR I'd borrowed from the Bartlett photography department. And when I gave it back to them, they were like...
Smelled like shit.
Yeah. I think it could have just been me, to be honest. That stuff gets in you.
Well, you were inhaling...
So I had like a 3M mask with like chewing gum inside, so at least it doesn't smell so bad. But I'm not even kidding. It's so... This is gross. The one thing you can't do when you're down there for that long is lick your lips.
Oh!
Yeah, because just the air gets on you.
What does it taste like?
Well, no, because you've got residue on you actual like...
Or is it salty though?
Oh, I didn't do it.
You did it?
Well, no, I've got residue of floating...
You did have a little lick.
No, it's like shit particles. It's disgusting, man.
You know, I didn't even live with anyone for the 3 years in uni because of... I have a thing of like sharing toilets.
Oh, really?
So that would have been a nightmare.
Yeah.
But what a story, man. Like an architecture course took you to almost your death.
Yeah, when I had my
smelly
my thesis supervisor at the time, he was shocked. I thought he was going to call social services or something.
What, you told him?
Yeah, well, because it was just photos of it in my thesis. And so he was just like, your university let you do this? So I was like, no, I didn't tell them. So he was not happy about it. But, and, you know, in hindsight, looking back now, it's absolutely stupid. Absolutely stupid. Like the amount of like, I mean, one of the guys there, his nickname was Otter because he once slipped, because it's really slippy because the bottom's shaped like an eggshell kind of thing, to make sure the materials keep moving. He slipped and went over and scraped his whole forearm open on a like nail while like floating like an otter, which is why his name was Otter. And so he had to go get like tetanus shots and all this stuff. And yeah, so it's
not my kind of sport.
No, I won't be doing that again. Yeah. But so anyway, that led to Haddon Gardens because I was obviously surprised about how different the environment could be when it's literally an inch away from the normal street. And what you found in the Hanging Gardens is in the tube lines, because this was the Circle Line, they just introduced ventilation. So you've got these ventilation things on the train pumping out heat. So it's really, really warm air. Plus you have skin and hair particles from the passengers, which actually really increases the nutrients in the air. It's kind of disgusting. And then you have brake linings as well, because they're pulling the brakes so often. You have a really high iron content in the air as well. Wow. Plus you have mosquitos down in the tube tunnels, right? Now they got in when they built the initial tunnels around London. Wow. But since getting
they haven't left.
Not only that, they've evolved to be in its completely, entirely separate species. They can't mate with above ground mosquitoes anymore. It's a London underground species. Wow. But they pollinate, like mosquitoes can pollinate. So it's using all these things together. So I worked with like botanists and UCL and stuff, and like figured out you could get like subtropical gardens suspended over these ventilation shafts. It was like little kind of the idea was to have it as like little community gardens, because although there's a lot of green space in London, about 25% of it is private gardens and a third of it is like parklands. But parklands, of all the space, it's like, anyway, a huge amount of parklands. But if you go to like a rural park and you try and plant a plant, you know, you're going to get arrested. So it's quite a passive spectator environment with sort of relationship with nature. And actually there's nowhere to like plant seeds or nurture growth or anything. So it's the idea about getting those into the center of the city to actually, you know.
It's incredible. There's so much to talk about. This is, you know, even I think so far we're on one of the longest episodes I've ever done. Yeah, right. And I think there's so much more I want to talk to you about. But just sort of coming to an end now. I mean, just another thing that I came across is, wait, I'm going to sneeze. No, I'm not. It was, does this ring a bell? A piece of cake.
Oh, yeah. Oh wow, yeah.
So I saw your experiences in Japan and everywhere else in Asia.
Yeah.
I brought up the previous example because I thought, wow, it shows that you've been interested in these kind of networked systems in the city for a very long time.
Yeah.
And now look at you. I mean, why don't you bring this into realization now as well?
Well, I mean, once it went through the Forgotten Spaces competition, it got exhibited in the National Theatre, and there was talk with TFL at an early stage about doing an actual
hanging garden.
Yeah, well, like doing a prototype, because there was a particular ventilation shaft nearby where you could do it and not have it directly over a live railway line. But then basically austerity came.
That would be so good because you could also exhibit those photos.
Yeah.
As like a Star exhibition. Anyway, I'm looking forward to seeing that. But a piece of cake, and I only found out after a while looking at it, was cake is Chris and Karen.
Yeah.
Karen exploring.
Yeah.
So a piece of Chris and Karen exploring.
Yeah.
Again, a nice name. You're good with these names. And it was essentially you guys going around Asia.
Yeah.
And I brought this up because again, it showed me that you're incredible. Wow, like really well produced videos.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, seriously, because obviously I have to do a bunch of editing and stuff now with this.
Yeah.
I found a lot of from my point of view, it was really well done. Because I think one of the difficulties and I think also one of the strengths of any videography is the music.
Yes.
And getting the audio and the visual kind of senses that you're, that are hitting your viewer, being, harmoniously kind of integrated. And I think once your sound and your visuals really match, then you usually end up with masterpieces. I think some of the best movies, best movie scenes have been
a full sensation experience.
Exactly, they've been amazing because of sometimes the music.
Yeah, absolutely.
But again, reason I brought this up is because as a practice, and I think it's almost quite a new era of this kind of multidisciplinary architecture practice. And we are in it because it's becoming quite common to have a multidisciplinary architecture practice. But you are definitely one of those practices, Hildrey Studios. Even videography, it would play a huge role in a practice, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think
you would do it.
Yeah, I mean certainly. And I'm sort of working on a music video at the moment, but it's not videography; it's more abstract animation. But like there is, I think for me, this comes back to the thing I remember thinking about some time ago. Is that I started studying architecture because I liked the skills involved in it, not because necessarily I loved architecture. Like
same.
I was in the first project in Edinburgh. Like we got a lot of first year things, you get a precedent study, right? And I think we got so we partnered up. So it was like 2 18-year-old kids, like me and one other guy, and then like we got Farnsworth House by Mies, and like I didn't know it at the time, right? Like and this other guy was like, "Oh, this is my favorite building." And I was like, "You have a favorite building?" Like I don't know what mine was. Like I don't know, like the swimming pool. Like I mean, I didn't have any of that knowledge.
This is so true of a lot of people coming into architecture.
Yeah, and like I think this guy was coming through this kind of parents were architects, growing up with that background and that kind of stuff. And for me, it was just like I knew I loved drawing. Like I liked knowing how things come together. Like from a technology point of view, how things go together. Like the kind of CDT, craft design technology kind of A-level stuff. I really enjoyed that. I enjoyed sort of theory and research and all of these things together. I really enjoyed. And then in the end, what I found is once I was pressed with sort of final year projects and stuff, is the most ideal product that I could have is like the USB I plug into my head and it prints out what's in my head. Like, because communication is so important, right? In terms of all creative disciplines, like, but especially in architecture, where, as I was saying earlier, like you're constantly describing something that doesn't exist. And as soon as it does exist, the project's over, right? So like, it's always about communication. And what I what I thought is that, I mean, I had seen projects where I had seen an all right idea presented really well, and then an incredible idea presented really badly. And every time, like, you go with the first, like with the former, right? Like, communication can grow or shrink an idea so much. And so for me, the methods of communication were so important. And this is why I've always done projects in addition to practice, like when I was an employee. So I was always doing a research degree or design as a residence, or, you know, hanging gardens competitions and things like that. And it's always a good way to sort of set yourself a challenge to communicate another thing, right? And also I just think if you can be versatile, then again, it doesn't tie you to one mode of communication. So, you know, some of the things that the schools come up with are absolutely beautiful end of year pieces and stuff. But like, again, that's like, it's such a skill and it's such a specific skill. But for me personally, like, I want to be able to get across a concept and retain like the fidelity of that concept. Like, I don't want something to be lost in translation. And for me, that's something I really value. And so being able to use, you know, like Photoshop and 3D and using, you know, After Effects, Premiere Pro and all these things, like knowing your way around them, just be able to, and being willing to put in the time to learn it is really critical. Because I mean, I think there's such an opportunity in architecture to take things to a more sort of a better communicated version of what it is now.
You know, for such a rich profession, and I struggle to find anything that is as concerned with the deepest philosophies of art and psychology and philosophy and multimedia communication, and then the real world built scientific engineering aspect. You know, I can't think of anything that's on par with this profession.
Yeah.
And then to see the realities of where we are, we have the longest working hours, we have some of the biggest dropout rates, we have some of the lowest salaries, you know, in ratio to how long we spend getting degrees and the level of debt people get into. What is the ideal future for this profession? Because I know that's a hard question to answer, but I kind of touched on it on the end of my dissertation, where I said we have to adapt and evolve with the technology and with the way things are going. And there is a lot of hesitance from people saying, oh, we're going to lose our own, you know, designer's agency of how buildings are designed if we get too caught up in technology, you know. But don't you think that the role of the architect, and I think I've seen you write about this as well, the role of the architect is rapidly changing. And it needs to continue to rapidly change. And if we are to solve those problems of, you know, salary and working conditions, and, you know, we have a lot of problems. If we are to solve those problems, because we have such an incredible profession, you know, the joy and the benefit that you can really, you know, project in this profession is incredible. For us to solve that, don't you think we also have to drastically change something? And I guess is that question then, are we supposed to take on that kind of polymath role and become the kind of the masters of all and almost jack of all trades and master of none? Or are we supposed to master one certain thing?
It's an interesting one, because I feel like what will happen will be sort of a plurality of things, you know, like it won't be one reaction. I don't see the profession like shifting in one way or the other, because as you said earlier, like, you know, some people come out of school, they want to do window details, they want to do bathroom schedules, that's what they want. And actually, like, some people really enjoy getting away from the conceptual side, actually. And some people want to be experts at the technical side and the regulation side. Some people just want a quiet life. Some people love to do the concept side and deal with clients and all this stuff. So there's a lot of different skill sets. And one thing that's great to architecture as well is there's a lot of different jobs through the process of a built project. You know, you start off pre-planning, you go through planning, you're dealing with consultants and stuff, then you're tendering, you're on site, you've got hard hat on. very different worlds at that. So I think there will always be people who will suit, what you might call more traditional practice. But I think increasingly people are finding that less rewarding and less relevant to what they see as a built environment that isn't working for everyone, and increasingly so. I think as well, as I said earlier, like the problems that are making that the case aren't specific to architecture or urban design. Like those problems don't care whether you're an urban designer or an architect or or part two or an architectural technician or whatever. It's like whatever you can do to tackle the problem is really important. So I think you're going to see the profession stretch and thin a little bit, right? Like kind of like pulling dough, because 75% of practices in the UK are like fewer than 10 people. Right, it's basically a cottage industry plus some big players, right? And in the middle, there's a lot of there's a few medium-sized ones, right? Like 50 is large, isn't it? So I guess 30 to 50, something like that. And what you're going to see, I think, is, BIM is getting more and more adopted, right? And now I spent 5 years working on Revit, for example. And then I worked in a place that didn't have it. And what I found is that the places that sort of don't have it I'd say the hardest transition I've seen ever in any professional environment is people going through CAD to BIM. The amount of monitors that nearly got thrown out of windows. And I went through it myself, and it's incredibly frustrating. It's a complete change in how you think. But it was very expensive to train people up to it, or train kind of the champions internally who would then train people up. Software, you're kind of locked in now to these subscription-based licenses rather than a one-off deal and stuff. It's quite expensive. And then what you get, I think, is you get smaller places where they might not be using BIM, but certainly where the projects might be of a certain type. And then you get large practices that are able to take advantage of huge technological advances that are quite expensive. So R&D budgets go up and all this stuff. And you tend to get this kind of splitting between smaller and larger, with the medium kind of squeezed out because they can't quite afford the technology. And yet, they're still kind of doing projects that aren't that big. And the middle ground becomes quite difficult. So for me, I just see this, just the fact that as things are getting more and more complicated, so for instance, these guys might make a balsa wood model, these guys might make a SLS 3D printed beauty, right? And they both go for the same competition, and it might be the case that people just preferred seeing something slick, but if you're in the middle, you can't afford the SLS, so you're still using balsa wood. So in more and more things, I think you're getting a stretching between large and small, or between traditional and less traditional.
So you think there's going to be a bigger gap?
Well, what I mean is that I think the profession is going to become less and less characterized by any one form of practice.
For me, this is one thing I think there's hope in.
Yeah, no, I agree. Yeah, I think that's a good thing. The difficulty I think you will have is people still relying on that question, what, is that architecture? Yeah. It's like, if your main question in life is that architecture, if you're looking at a company, it's like, is that architecture? It's like, that's not the important thing, Yeah, it's like if people
that for uni.
Yeah, well, if people go to a museum and they say, is this art? It's like, just enjoy the bloody thing, that. Yes, there is room for that discussion, but at the end of the day, the more important thing with architecture, or whether it's some kind of whatever you want to call it, some kind of intervention in the built environment, is what's its end effect? Is it making the built environment better? I just think the challenge for me is going to be making sure that we can, nurture a successful business environment, sort of environment as from a business point of view that can afford to pay people, and can have social good. And at the moment, we're not adequate as a profession in terms of paying people's salaries or in terms of their overtime and working hours and well-being. I would say we're not really doing that well in terms of social benefit. And if we can start to adapt, for me, it doesn't matter whether we drive it or we're pulled in that direction through commercial forces or otherwise. Like, I just think as long as we the only danger for me is people who refuse to change. And that's where you're going to see it struggle, because I've seen some practices where they're like, no, we are, that kind of.
Do you want to name any?
No.
Oh, okay.
But like, where it's like, we are, I don't know, where the practice wants to be like Zumthor or Corbusier or Mies, like some, like, the architect type thing.
But in a way, you're talking about this diversity of in a way, they are kind of going to become their own thing in a way.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
sure.
they're going to be that realm of. Right now, we're obsessed with that because there might not be that much diversity.
Yeah.
We know the architects, we know the developer-centric architecture firms, we know the tiny 3-man office, firms as well. But I think in 15, 20 years' time, we probably will have the digital tech architects, the edible catering architects, the ones who are doing everything to do with expressionism and postmodern madness. And I think this is one of the things that I completely agree with, and I think we are heading in this way. And your practice is almost a sign of this as well. And it's that we're going to continue to diversify, and we need to diversify in not just how we practice, but even in those people who we employ. You might need to employ, I can't remember who it was. Even you look at Jan Gale, the urbanist, who, although I wrote something in some ways quite negative about him, I also wrote many positive things about him, and I think overall he's been a positive force. His practice, for example, being one of those positive things, is the structure. If you go on their page and just go to their about us, look at who is employed, you'll find 8 architects out of 50 employees.
Okay.
Most of those people are like anthropologists, and some of them are like psychologists, and I think that's the way we might end up going. And it sounds like you kind of agree with that.
Yeah, I'm sort of facing similar things at the moment as I'm in the process of sort of a bit of growth, and I've got sort of technology things and other things and like architect things, and it's like, how do you hire one person for that? And it's like, it does become more tricky. But I think as people become, I suppose I was going to say, like, as people want to do those variety of things, I think that will help things change more as well, because being a small architecture only practice, like, I think that would be hard, right? Because if you are a small architecture, but especially if you're like, a lone practitioner or something, and if you're doing the sort of, 3 to 5 years of doing like competition work or little installations or that kind of stuff that's sort of scraping you by, and then eventually you get like a house extension, that kind of traditional path of building is basically like, you have to leapfrog your way out of that pond somehow, because if you start getting pre-qualification questionnaires on tenders that say you need to have X amount of experience already, or show us how many architects you have, and you're a small practice, it's actually really hard now for small practices.
My old practice,
to grow.
Same thing.
Yeah, so it's kind of capped, and I think, those kind of places surely have to diversify, because I think from a business point of view as well, diversification is much better, because if the construction industry goes on hold for a few months, so it's like, I'll turn my attention to the other stuff.
Yeah, and there's times where practices are looking for more jobs, and they go out networking. And instead of doing that, maybe try to find, and I don't want to sound like I know a lot, because I definitely don't, but but it makes sense to cling on to other ways you can design, because the tool set that you have, and I'm thinking of a certain director, and the tool set I know that this person has is so broad. Why not do some sort of branding jobs? Why not do some sort of graphic jobs? Why not do some sort of film or, even production jobs? And I think that's the beauty of it at the end of the day. And thank God for the word design. Because, at the end of the day, I'd like to call myself a designer as well as an architect. Because, that's again why, in this two worlds design, it's called design. Even this podcast is design talks. I purposefully haven't gone for architecture because I know this is going to diversify, and I know if I'm in it for the longevity, design is the way to go. Just to finish off, because we should finish off.
Well, that is a long one.
Yeah. What would be your advice for architecture students?
Big question. I mean, I suppose it depends on the student, really. I know that's a silly answer, but I think understand what it is that you want, essentially, right? Because some people will want to do architecture, some people won't. And one of the things about doing multidisciplinary stuff is it's inherently risky as well, because, you might never be known for what you're doing. But also having to put different hats on every day, that's quite taxing. True. It was a few days ago, I had a sort of thing where I was having a meeting with a bank, a phone call with a financial regulator. I was speaking to a council about implementation and training. I was speaking to a DJ about polynomial fractal relationships for the video, and then speaking to a client about, actually going through planning processes.
This is why you need a multidisciplinary firm where you can have 7 of those people doing those.
Yeah, which is great. That would be nice. That would be a dream. But it isn't the easy route, but I would say it's ultimately worth it, because I make it sound so easy, just know what you want to do. That's part of the journey, and everybody is constantly figuring it out. But if you can be, have your radar set to search on that frequency, that as you're doing stuff, every project that happens in uni, there's usually something to pull out of it that you have enjoyed. Even if you don't like the topic, or you don't like the brief, or, or you don't like the tutor, whatever it is, there's usually, you might find yourself preferring the research and that kind of stuff. And it's hard to know what it is that you actually like. It takes time. So I found, for instance, that in university, I would make 2 problems. One, I would spend far too long on the research because I just really liked that part of it. To the point where one of my crits, I presented just a site model with no proposal. Wow. Yeah, it didn't go well. And then, but the other part is that I would also really enjoy the communication process. And so I'd be thinking of the title before I've got a proposal. I'd be thinking of the style of the building, or of representation, or how I'm going to approach the 3D before I've really interrogated the architectural problem.
But that's what you loved.
Well, that's what I was leaning towards. And it took years for me to think backwards and think actually, those are the things, that's maybe just where my brain goes. And I spent ages trying to make sure that I didn't do that, because obviously any normal person doing an architecture course would be straight into doing the architectural questions, right? And I ended up going for the architectural questions in some ways and tempering that tendency. But in the end, I realized because I do love architecture as a profession, and I love working in it. It's really enjoyable. But I do find as well that as long as I understand myself, and I understand that, but the architecture I want to do, I enjoy the process of it, but I also really like the research of it, and I like the presentation of it. So it lets me kind of appreciate the different parts of each stage. And if you can do that, you can try and avoid the stages you don't. Well, not avoid them, but, speed them up. And so I think try and understand what it is that you enjoy doing.
And you only do that through trying more new things.
Yeah, absolutely. And also get out and speak to bonus bit of advice is get out and speak to as many people as possible, because
or just listen to this podcast.
Stay indoors, listen to every episode of this. But especially if you're in London, it's such a great place to study, because you're never more than 30 minutes from a world expert, basically, and most people are happy to chat and share if you've got some interest in what they're doing. And You know, like if you're ever doing a thesis or anything and you find something behind a paywall, a good example is like you just send the authors an email, they'll send you it for free. You know, like people are happy to help as long as you don't take the piss. And like most cases, yeah.
Speaking to you has been incredibly inspiring, man, because especially that last bit of advice kind of really honed it in for me. That I think I have even struggled with really thinking, am I interested in architecture? And I'm sat here doing a podcast, you know, and I often even feel insecure about my designs. I'm like, am I really good at, you know, there are those people who, you know, they've been doing CAD since they were 16 because their dad worked in a practice. And I'm like, I'm not like, but that level of freedom and diversity is there in our profession. We are able to, and you're an example of that, Chris Hildrey. You know, you've had a specific interest in architecture, you've pursued that, and now in some ways you're kind of changing the whole country, you know, without trying to, you know, make it sound, you know, but it's true. You know, you're behind now a really, really powerful and major government initiative that's gonna hopefully, and probably already is, helping hundreds, maybe thousands of people. And that all came from your background in architecture. So I've been incredibly inspired speaking to you.
Appreciate that.
And it kind of gives me confidence in the future that I can hopefully get to as well.
Yeah, amazing.
Amazing. Thanks, man.